So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to kind of outline it a little bit. I've done this like a demo. It would normally be a talk at a normal one of our meetups, but given that it was demo night, I thought let's be really ambitious and try to do this all live coded. So I apologize. I'm sure there will be mistakes, but I've got like a bunch of different examples saved, so hopefully one of them will work if what I'm coding doesn't. What I'm going to show tonight, I'll get rid of that sidebar there, is GraphQL, and specifically using GraphQL with React. Because it's one of those things where I've personally been really interested in GraphQL for a while. There's a lot of interesting things that are going on with it, and I keep seeing all these interesting features and stuff. But in terms of like actually the concrete use of it and like how to go and like take a GraphQL server and like connect to it from your app, it seemed like there was a lot of magic going on there, and I hadn't seen a lot of good examples of how you could actually do that in a really simple way. So I think it was last month or the month before, Apollo, which is one of the big kind of client and server libraries for GraphQL, came out with a project called Apollo Boost. And basically, it's sort of like the difference between, say, I don't know, like using Sinatra, if you're familiar with Sinatra and Ruby, and Rails. So you have Apollo client, which is what they've had for a long time, and it's what a lot of projects use. And then Apollo Boost is sort of like a more opinionated stack that goes along with it. So it has Apollo client in it, along with a bunch of other stuff that they think you might need. And the idea is that it was meant to make it really easy to pick up and code. So I'm like, okay, this is perfect. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick up and code. So I'm going to walk you guys through the process that I went through to do that in this demo and how to tie it into a simple React app. And hopefully it'll be enough that if you guys want to use GraphQL in one of your apps, you can. So we're going to be working against a GraphQL server, and to do that, we have to have a GraphQL server running somewhere. So I will pull it over here onto this screen now so you can see it. So this is my GraphQL server. It's running on my local host, and I'll make that a bit bigger so everyone can see it. And one of the things that's running is a tool called GraphQL. It's basically something that you can attach to an Express server. You can just use it on a certain route. And what it lets you do is have this nice little UI for hitting your GraphQL endpoint and exploring how it works, writing queries and stuff like that. So you'll see me bouncing back and forth a lot here to use write queries and stuff like that I'll then use in my code. The other nice thing too is that because it's GraphQL, there's documentation that it automatically generates. So you can see here, I've got like a list of queries, and you can go in, and the ones we'll be using reviews. So it just tells you here, you can see the little square brackets mean that it's an array of reviews that you get back from it. And you can keep clicking through to find out reviews have IDs, stars, and commentary. And the other thing that we have to point out too is that it takes in an episode, because you get reviews for an episode, because the data set that we're using is the classic GraphQL one that you'll see a lot. It's the Star Wars data set. So we have reviews of all the different Star Wars movies and stuff like that. So the other one we'll use, we've got reviews, and we're going to use one called search a little bit too. And it returns a search result. And basically what a search result is it's either a human, a droid, or a starship. And then we can interrogate each one of them depending on the kind it is and show different information in our view. So if this all goes smoothly, I will be showing you guys how to do that. So just a show of hands, who here has used GraphQL at all before? Okay. Who here has used React before? Okay, so some more familiarity with React, less with GraphQL. The only other big things that I'll point out with GraphQL before we get too carried away is that you're almost kind of describing like on the left is your query. It's almost like a JSON that comes in and kind of describes the structure that you would like out in your result. So here, if I run this, this is what my query looks like. I'm running the reviews query. I'm passing in the Empire Strikes Back. And then here, it's almost like the shape of the result I'd like to see. So each one of these you can sort of think of them as the JSON keys for the JSON that will come back. So if I run this query here, you can see the JSON that comes back has a value for each one of those. And if I, let's say, didn't care about ID, I could take that out and run it again, and it just basically drops it. So that's one of the cool things about GraphQL is that you can kind of describe the shape of what you want to get back. And do that as a client rather than doing that on the server. Along with queries, the other important thing to know is that GraphQL comes with this just like a concept of mutations. So queries, they're not going to modify the data. Mutations are things that will have a side effect and will change things on the server. So in our case, we only have a really simple one that creates a review. So that's what we're going to work with in terms of mutating data on the server. And yeah, I guess the only thing is I'll point out the server is just running locally here, but the code for it is up on GitHub. So if you wanted to try it there, you could. All right, any questions before I move on? We're going to go pretty fast here. Okay, so this is what we're going to start with. It's a very basic app. The only thing I've done is use create React app to scaffold things. For the sake of the demo, I'm going to do everything here in index.js. If you were in a real app, you'd want to break these out into different files and stuff, but we'll ignore all those best practices because it takes too long. So the first thing you're going to do to add it is go and switch to yarn, or switch to your terminal, and you're going to do yarn, and we're going to add a couple things. So to use Boost, we're going to go and first add, I have a list here, I want to make sure I don't forget anything. Apollo Boost. We're going to add React Apollo, which is the package that actually does the binding from Apollo, which is the GraphQL client, to React. Okay, so React Apollo. We're going to do GraphQL tag, which I'll explain when we use it a little later. But basically, it lets you take text strings and turn them into trees of objects that represent a GraphQL query. So it's almost like kind of parsing your query, I guess. And then finally, GraphQL, because that's the actual data structures that describe the query and the results and things like that. So let's see how my internet is. Not great. Okay, so maybe we'll carry on. Okay, that wasn't too bad actually. So now let's just start our server just to make sure that that will work still. I think I've got one running. Okay. All right, so if that all went smoothly, what you're going to see is this. This is the standard. You've just created a new React app. This is what you'll see when you first start up. So we'll be coming back to that. All right. So at this point, we've got the client installed, but we need to go and actually pull in the code to connect to it. So we'll come back over here, and we'll do this in Visual Studio Code. The first thing we'll do is we're actually going to go and forget about React to start with. We'll just pull in the Apollo GraphQL client that we can run GraphQL queries against, just to kind of see how it works and see what a query looks like when we're doing that. So import Apollo client from Apollo Boost. Okay. All right, and then const client equals new Apollo. Okay, so I'll just type this out and then I'll explain what I'm doing here. Okay. So what we've done here is we've created a new Apollo client from Apollo Boost. And this is the part where it's kind of opinionated. And so when we do that, it's a little different than just using Apollo client on its own. It's going to pull in some standard things that do error handling, that do like local state management and caching, and just kind of make some of the decisions for you that you would normally have to make in Apollo client. So when you see in other examples on the web, it'll say import an Apollo client from Apollo client. You could almost think of it as the same for the most part until you get into that more advanced stuff, like handling local state errors. So to run a query against it, it's super simple. We go client query, and then we're going to put our query in, and it returns a promise. Is anyone here not familiar with what a promise is? It's basically just a way to get a value out of something, right? It's the promise that there'll be a value later. So we're saying when this query returns a value, then we want to do something with it. Yeah, kind of similar to a callback. Yeah. Okay, so we'll take our result, and just to keep it really simple, we will log it to the console. So this is running in the browser now. So to receive the results of that, we're going to need to go to the browser. But one thing we're missing is our actual query. So let's say, why don't we pull out some of the reviews? Query equals. And we'll jump over here to our other tab. One moment. Not that one. That one. Yeah. Okay. So we'll grab this and bring it back over here. Okay. Yeah, I do. I'm going to kind of explain the difference here. So right now, like that's normally how you would think you would type a query, right, as a string. But the problem is that we need a way to be able to take this and load it in to the GraphQL query. And the actual GraphQL query is expecting a GraphQL query object. So we could go and we could build that ourselves by pulling in all the GraphQL details. But that's where we use some of those handy little helpers. So we're going to import GraphQL from GraphQL. And we're going to import GQL. I just want to make sure I've got this right. Yeah. GQL from GraphQL tag, right? GQL from tag. So, and what we're going to do is there's a special kind of string in JavaScript called a string literal. And one of the interesting things about it is that you can go and insert values into it. You can do some interesting things that you can't do with a normal string. And one of those interesting things is take that string and pass it into a function that will transform it in some way. So what we're doing is we're importing the GQL function from GraphQL tag. It's going to take that string, parse it, turn it into the GraphQL objects that our query expects. So we don't have to do that manually ourselves. So basically you can look at this and think, even though it looks like a string, this value is actually going to be an object of a GraphQL query. So there we go. And I think I can drop that. All right, so let's see if this works. Okay, so that's compiled. Okay, I'm just going to open a new tab. Right. Okay, I forgot to do something. 1 second. Let me just check. Apollo client, Apollo Boost, GQL tag. Oh, you know, I said URI or URL instead of URI. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Okay. Oh, it's still not linking though. 3001 Apollo client from Apollo Boost. Okay, let's just stop that for a second. Okay, so 1 second. This is where I'm going to cheat because it's a live demo. Step 1. Okay, so we're now on step 1, everyone. I'm just going to make sure it's got everything installed. Yeah, okay, yarn start. And I'm just going to make sure that it's connecting to localhost in this one. Okay, so obviously I've done something different there. I don't order that too much. Okay, I have these running on another server just for this eventuality. Okay. Okay, so what we've got here in our console is we've got the results from our query. So they come back as a sort of interesting object. So you've got a data property, which is the actual result of the query, as well as a couple of things that say whether it's loading. This tells you whether it's like a reload or if it's waiting to fetch the data, things like that. Oh yeah, sorry, of course, yeah. There you go. Is that better? Yeah. So it's going to tell you like if it's loading, what the actual status is. If there was an error, you would see it here too. And inside the data property, you can see that in my example here, we're actually querying for a hero. So we've asked for the heroes from the different movies. So in this case, we're getting the hero from the Return of the Jedi, and it's saying that R2-D2 is the hero of that. I don't think that's necessarily true, but that's what we've decided. So right now, what we're doing is we're getting back an object that represents our data. The next thing we want to do is take that and find a way to actually connect it to a React app. Because right now it's coming in, we can see it in the console, but it's not very useful there, right? We're going to want to see it somewhere more interesting than that. So that will bring me to the next part, is connecting with React. Okay, so in here, what we're going to do is pull in something called React Apollo, and specifically Apollo Provider. So for anyone that has been looking at that new context stuff that is in React, a provider is basically something that provides a context. So what we're going to do is actually set up an Apollo provider, which will provide a kind of a GraphQL context for our app. So from that point on, anything that's using GraphQL will connect to our Apollo library to do that. So I'll show you right here. It's super easy. So why don't I change this? We won't use app in a minute, but we will keep using it for now. All right. Let's just make that look a bit nicer. So what we're doing is basically we're wrapping our app in an Apollo provider, okay? So at this point, we've added GraphQL to our application, but we need to do something with it. So the easiest way to do that is using a new component that we get from this called Query. So I will import it up here. And it'll basically let us take that query that we had before, and I'll get rid of app, to be honest. And we can pass in a query that it will then parse and use again. So why don't I come over here and I'll take this query that we had there. Okay. So right now, we're going to run that query when this component is rendered, but we need to take it and actually do something with the data that we get out of it. So what you'll see is that it uses a kind of technique that you'll see where it renders its children as a function. So when you pass in the children, instead of passing in a set of DOMs and things like that, you actually want to pass in a function. And that function is going to receive as properties of its argument, it's going to receive the data that we saw before, loading, error, things like that, which we can then use to render in our React component. So let me just find it. It's called the render prop pattern is kind of what they call that, but you'll see it in other libraries like React Router too. So right here, we'll pass this in. So, and we're going to make it a function that takes in data, loading, and error. And here we're going to say, okay, I'm just making sure I'm matching my brackets. Okay, so if loading loading. What did I do wrong there? Oh, you're right, yeah, right here. Okay, there we go. So that will show a loading message if we're loading. If error, it'll do the same thing. And instead, though, error is usually a string, so you can show that like that. And then otherwise, we're going to get back the results of that query. So data dot reviews dot map. We'll take those, and each review has stars and commentary. So if I'm doing this properly, we can go and say, okay, so if I've done that right, doesn't make something. There we go. Okay, does that look right? All right, so let's see if our React app is still running. Oh, you're right, yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay. So let's try that over. There we go. So it's loading and doesn't like that. So let's just check there. One second. Let me check my example again. It's down here. Data.reviews. Okay, let's just make sure we actually have some reviews on the server. I know what it is. Okay, we'll carry on with our characters. I think my backup server doesn't have any reviews on it. Okay, so we'll replace this with that. Okay, let's try one more time. There we go. So now what we're doing is we're running that query, and it's populating that data property that goes into our component with the results of the query after it's done loading. So you can see here, basically what we've got is when it's loading, that loading is going to be true. So it returns our loading message. If there's errors, it would show what they are. And otherwise, data.characters will be set, and we can go through and see them in our app. Okay. So are there any questions up to this point? Like, are people kind of understanding how we're using a query and then passing what it returns as properties? Yeah.
So I'm new to GraphQL. Can you do complicated queries like you can like SQL?
Yeah, so like you can do a couple things. I mean, there's lots of kind of different ways to express your queries. One thing you'll see in larger projects is you'll actually go and kind of reuse these. So you'll have like a separate file that has a bunch of your queries in it, maybe. So you can use them for different components and in different places in your app. But you can also use, you'll see fragments are another thing where you're basically saying, like, let's say this is what we want to call a character. So we could make a character fragment that always had ID and name and appears in. And then we could reuse that in all of our queries and always return the same kind of shape for a character when we're displaying it. So is that kind of what you mean in terms of more complicated queries?
Probably. I'll have to look more into everything.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So why don't I show you next quickly what we can do just in terms of making our queries a little more complicated. We can change this and we can do a search. So down here, we're going to show name and what they appear in. So let's go back here. I'm just going to jump into my GraphQL, and we're going to use search. So we're going to go query search. And so we're going to go search. We're going to take in text to search for, and let's search for Luke, say. Human name and appears in. Okay, so let's run this and see. So this is a little more complicated query now. So what we're basically saying is we're going to run a search, and a search returns a search result, which could be a couple different things. It could be a person, a droid, a ship, all sorts of different things. And their properties are similar, but they're not all the same. So what we're going to do here now is we can use these fragments and basically say, here's a fragment for if it returns a person, or a human, excuse me, here's a fragment for if it returns a droid, here's a fragment for a ship. So if we wanted to do, say, R2-D2 now, we could say on droid and name, and then droids have like weird attributes. Primary function, let's say, because we wouldn't get that for a person. So now if we update this and say R2, we can see that we get back different properties, right? So we can take this and turn it into a query that goes into our component that takes in variables, right? So right now here, this value is like hard-coded into the query. But if we were doing a search form or something like that, we probably want to be able to go and pass that in as a value. So I'll show you guys how to do that really quickly here. I'm going to show you one more thing after this, and then I'll probably wrap because I realize we're just about at a half an hour now. So right here, we'll update our query. And we're going to change it so we can pass in a variable now. And so the way we do that is we go and we say here, we give the variable a name, and then you can actually do it here, which is nice. And then it'll tell you the types that it accepts. So we could say string. All right. Yeah, that's okay. So here, we're going to pass it in, and then we'll use that variable here. And so one of the cool things is, let's say we're going to keep looking for... Oh, text to test. You're right. Yeah. Thank you. So down here, this will still work, except we're missing something now because we need a variable in there. So we can just pass those in as a property. So the variable is called text, and we'll call it... this is what I get for typing in front of a crowd, isn't it? Variables. There we go. Okay, and I'm missing actually another thing here too, aren't I? All right, so we're passing in a variable whose value is Luke, and down here, okay, so he should come back if I do this properly. Or it finds everyone. Search. Characters query. That seems very weird. I don't know. Let's check. I'm wondering too if this is a cache issue, maybe? No. Okay, let's check. The old one. Yeah, you're right. So which one are we in now? Step 2. Okay. Okay. Oh, characters is undefined. Oh, that's why, because it's search. There we go. So after all that, we got it. So if we want to break it again, though, because this is fun, so we can change this now and make it R2. And this is not going to work because it's not going to have the property. It'll be missing one. Yeah. See, so it's saying that appears in is missing because we don't have that for him. So what we need to do is come back here, and if we just add that here, it will now work for droids. There we go. Okay. So what you can see, I was going to show you guys how to like hook this up to a form and things like that, but I think, you know, if you're using React, you probably know how to do form handling. But you can see here that you would just do this as, you know, maybe a nested component inside a stateful form or something like that, or however you want to handle it, as long as it gets passed in a property that it can put into its variables to do the search, right? So, any questions about that part? Okay, so we'll keep moving.
Variables in React actually go into the query. It's something about the object that GraphQL returns.
Yeah, so here, it can, when it parses this, it sees the, like the dollar sign is kind of a special symbol in GraphQL. So it parses it, and when it builds the object, it knows that the object has spots for like a text variable. And so then when you do it down here, it'll insert it properly into the query and stuff like that. So I'll just quickly show you, because it's really easy, I guess. So you could just take it here and just say, like, text. And then here, instead of doing R2, we would say text. Or actually, let's go like that. And then come down here where we're saying character list, and now we would say text equals R2, like that. And if we come back here, yeah. So you can see now, like you would wrap that in a form or something to pass those values in. So we're getting values from it. The last thing I want to show you is just quickly how we can do mutations, right? Because it's great to be able to retrieve values. It's useful to also be able to change them. They work almost the same way using the tags, but the way it kind of passes properties and stuff around is a little different. So let's erase this, and we'll just jump straight to step 3, and I'll just quickly show you how it works. Yeah, so here we go. So this one, we've got a similar setup. We have, instead of doing a query, we're going to do a mutation, and it's going to take in a couple things. It's going to take in a variable for episode, stars, and commentary, and then create a review for that episode. And mutations, just like queries, you can kind of specify the shape of what you would like to have returned to you as well. So when you create a review, it will return the review back to you as well. And so here, you know, we can get back the ID, stars, commentary, just kind of make sure that it created it properly. So to actually go down here and make a component to add the review, we're going to go and have a component that takes in the name of the episode, I think it is. Or no, what is this? Episode is what that should say. So it'll pass in the episode. It goes and, just like with query, instead of passing in the query property, you pass in a mutation property. And that will set up the mutation, but unlike query, it doesn't run as soon as you render the component. It's going to go and create a function that'll pass in to that child that you can then use to trigger the mutation when you're ready. So in this case, we have like a really simple form, and the child function is being passed in something called add review. So you can see how that here is the same name that we have, up here in our query. So whatever it's called here is what it'll be passed through as a function. And when we call it, that function will take in a set of variables. So we can pass in everything that we parse from the form, for example, or whatever else we need to run that mutation. And the other kind of weird thing with mutations is that the child function also receives a data property. And the data property is sort of like the result of the mutation. So before it's run, it's not going to be set. But then after it's run, that's where we would get back the details of the review that created, things like that. So I'm just trying to look and see if there's anything I'm missing here. Semicolon. And add review. Episode equals hope, let's say. Okay, I'm going to stop our other one and let's see if this one starts. We're on step 4. Did I break it? Oh, mutation. Oh, right. Yeah. Okay, and return. Where does my bracket match there? Here? Okay. I think I've matched my brackets. So let's say awesome. And we won't actually see. It's not a function. This is not a good demo, I'm sorry. Okay, well, I won't spend too much more time with that. I'll fix the source code and I'll put it up on GitHub. But yeah, that's the idea, is that when you're doing mutations, you're going to be passing a function in to that child function that you then call when you want to trigger the mutation. So I'm not going to go into too much more beyond this. The other things that you'll want to explore are using, there's a function that you can call too, called GraphQL, that comes from React Apollo. And it's kind of what's working behind the scenes in both the mutation and the query components. And it really kind of exposes the guts of how things work. So you can go and it takes in your query and it produces a new function whose job it is to map another component to that query. It's called a higher order function, basically. And so you run it once with your query, it produces this new function, and then you take your component and pass it in, and it kind of does that wiring so that when you render your component, it will have all of these little kind of GraphQL properties that we're using here for like mutations and query data and stuff like that will be set on it so that you can use it. And so one of the interesting things there is that usually when you call GraphQL, you call it once per query that you want to have. But often in a production app, you're going to have a bunch of queries that you might want to expose in one component. So sort of the same way how Redux works, there's a compose thing where you can say this component is going to take in like 2 or 3 queries from different parts of the app or something like that, and set them all as properties that that component will receive. So you'll see a lot of things there where it says they import compose from React Apollo, and then they have a bunch of things that call GraphQL with different queries or mutations. And then at the end, they pass their component into that. And really all you have to know is that it's going to use more than one query or more than one mutation in the component that you're creating. So, all right. So I hope I explained this a little well. Like I was trying to show that it's really not that intimidating. If I can do it, you guys can definitely do it. And like a lot of it is going to be happening behind the scenes anyway. Like once you learn how to use the query and the mutation or how to use the GraphQL function, that'll get you 95% of the way there. Did you have a question?
Nope.
Oh, okay. All right. Were there any questions that people had? Yeah.
Are we on? I've not used GraphQL, so how does the backend work? Is it?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of options. I mean, really, all GraphQL has in it is a description of this is what a valid GraphQL query and mutation looks like. And it doesn't define like anything about kind of implementation of how you're even sending queries to the server and how they're going to work there. So for this case, there's a bunch of different kind of GraphQL libraries that you can use depending on the stack and stuff like that. So here I'm using Express, And I'm going to use, right here, there's Apollo server, which basically provides the server thing. And what you do there is, I'll quickly open this. Because this is one of the things that threw me a lot when I was first starting too. This is the schema. So can everyone see that? Like, is that big enough that people can see? So basically, we have this big, long schema string. And what it is it basically is a set of definitions of the different types, the different queries you can do, everything that we're going to see in our GraphQL endpoint, right? So these are all the different classes. You can see like enums, which would be stuff like we use an enum for the kind of movies that you have, but they're using it here for length. So we have our schema. It has all of these different things in it. I'm going to scroll past it because you don't need to see all of it. But then down here is where we actually get into the implementation. So in my server, it's basically just arrays that we're using for everything. So I have an array of humans, where each one is like an object with all of the properties that you might be interested in set. And then I also have a little thing here where I basically map them into an object that's keyed by the IDs. You can see some cut and pasting there too. I called it ship still. And same for droids, same for ships. And what this gives us is a way to either access them as a one set or access them by key. And then down here, we have a bunch of functions that we're going to map from our schema to these JavaScript functions. So that happens down here in this magical function where we set a set of resolvers. So we say for a query, for the different kinds of queries that you can do, these are the variables that would get passed in. And then this is how it maps to the function. Whatever the function returns, it will return as well. We have mappings for the mutations. There's some special things where you can kind of add properties to the different types that GraphQL exposes. And I'll skip the rest of this. That's basically what we're doing for the rest of it here. And then down here, basically the last thing that we do as we go is we make an executable schema. And what it does is it takes in that whole long schema string, as well as that set of resolvers, and maps them together into something that we can expose. Because it's doing a couple things for us there. Like, you'll notice all of our functions up here, let's say like get droid, it's going to return the full droid from that array with all of its properties set. But when you wrote your query, maybe you're only interested in like the name and which movies it's in. So that make executable schema will do stuff like that, where it trims out properties you don't need and things. So it just does a lot of the heavy lifting for you.
So I guess, sorry, follow-up question.
Yeah.
That's really cool. It's also kind of complex looking, like
Yeah.
that versus MongoDB database.
Yeah.
Like,
So there's a bunch of different options that are just kind of coming up now to address that.
Yeah.
So one of them that it's actually Apollo is working with, and GraphQL, or I'm not quite sure what the name of the company is. They have a thing called Prisma, and so what you do with that is it has a SQL database on the back end that it presents in a standard way a bunch of kind of different operations like queries and mutations you can do directly against the tables. And so their idea there is that you would then have a thin kind of business layer on top of that that you could use to map your query to like an actual SQL database or something like that. And you can even, when you're kind of bootstrapping, for example, you could just expose that Prism one, which I don't think you're supposed to do, but you certainly could while you were bootstrapping, and quickly get an API running that way. And there's also a lot of tools that will help define that, where like you just define your schema, for example, and a couple object types, and they'll kind of take care of writing all those resolvers for you and do that. So, yep.
Just to fill in maybe a couple blanks there. Like there's basically libraries for every language. So like I've worked a lot with the Ruby library, and you essentially write your types, so describing what type of data is available, and then you write your resolvers that go and query your database and pull that out, and the schema is automatically generated. So the complexity that you see there is really hidden behind any given library that you would use on the back end. So to actually add GraphQL to your API is a really simple, straightforward process. It's actually very nice. And then you get all the benefits on the front end as well.
Have you seen anything that will take like a REST endpoint and expose it as GraphQL?
Yeah, like so essentially your graph/GraphQL, you can handle that as it's essentially a REST endpoint that then accepts the string for queries and mutations,
Right.
and then returns the proper response. So if you have a REST API already, essentially you're adding one more endpoint,
Right.
and
to do
then
that.
getting a GraphQL
Right.
API after that. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Were there any other questions about how this all works? Yeah.
You mentioned it like it's going back to, it's very complicated here on the server side. One of the kind of neat things is we're actually looking to use this, like all the comments are kind of made out like in a new project. We have an existing site with lots of different backend services. Sometimes we need to pull data from a database, like a CMS SQL database. Sometimes it's coming from an API endpoint. Sometimes it's like a JSON file or something. We're looking at using GraphQL to kind of power our data layer, so you can make a single request. And like an example here, maybe characters is in a NoSQL database, and reviews is in a SQL database, and whatever else. With those resolvers, you can write different resolvers for different data types. So you can make a single request and pull data from like 6 different sources and return it a single response. So that's where we're really excited to use this, because it allows us to tie all these totally different things together.
Yeah. I think that's totally true. Like one of the nice things with GraphQL is because it doesn't have like a specific implementation, it's almost like just the query language itself. It's a lot like SQL, where you can have a bunch of different vendors that are providing like different options for how you work with that. And I think that's where like it just seems like we're just getting started with it, because there's going to be so many different people doing kind of cool things with it. A couple other things. If you do want to check out it, there's really cool things called subscriptions, where you can get like live updates. Apollo has this concept of links, so there's sort of like express middleware that you can put into the client to do stuff like error handling or caching. That's how they do their local state. But you can see things where, like, if you have, let's say, 2 versions of an API, you can like switch between the endpoints that it's using. There's all sorts of things that you can do there. So if you are getting into it, one of the things I would really encourage you to look at once you've got the basics down is look at how the links work, because you'll see them a lot, and especially when you're dealing with errors and things. And it can be really intimidating at first, but once you kind of have your head around what a link is, it all starts to resolve a lot more clearly. So, yeah. All right, well, maybe we'll wrap it there. Thank you very much.
Exchange.js is Edmonton's JavaScript meetup. Thanks to our sponsors, Jobber and Investopedia. Support the meetup and like and share this video, and stay informed by following us on Twitter and meetup.com. Links in the description. See you soon!